Lots of websites and YouTube videos promote a do-it-yourself Miracle-Gro fertilizer. How good is this stuff? And is it something that you should be using? Well, in this video, I'm going to have a closer look at one of the most popular recipes. And now I'll give you my opinion as to whether or not this is a good idea. This is one of the most popular recipes I found. Take 1 gallon of water and add 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, a half a teaspoon of ammonia. Now, some of the recipes leave it at that and use that to water their plants, and others consider this a concentrated solution. They recommend diluting it further. The recipe on the screen, which I've copied directly from the website, suggested that you take 1/8 to 1/4 cup of this concentrate and dilute it in 4 cups of water. Let's have a closer look at the ingredients in this fertilizer. The first one is 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt. Well, Epsom salts is magnesium and sulfur. Most fertilizers do not have magnesium in them. It is a macronutrient and plants do need it, but most of our water systems have enough magnesium in it that fertilizers don't have to add any more. Sulfur can be beneficial for plants, and it is a nutrient plants need. Most fertilizers do add some of that. The second item is baking soda. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. The bicarbonate part is HCO3. That's hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And plants get all of that from the air and the water they absorb. They don't need it in their fertilizer. The other component in baking soda is sodium. Now, plants need a very, very low amount, but sodium is one of those things that becomes toxic to plants very easily. It's not something you should ever add in your fertilizer mix. The third ingredient is half a teaspoon of household ammonia. Now, ammonia is NH3, so it's mostly nitrogen plus some hydrogen in there. So it's about 83% nitrogen. Household ammonia is already a diluted solution, and it's generally around 7%. What I've done is calculated the amount of nitrogen in this DIY fertilizer. Nitrogen is the most important nutrient, and it's important that we give plants enough nitrogen or they just won't grow well. So the amount here is quite important. The details of the calculation are on the screen. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can pause the video and have a look at it. The final concentration of nitrogen is 0.00025% or 2.5 parts per million. Now let's compare the nutrients in this DIY fertilizer to Miracle-Gro. And I've selected the one I always use, and that's the 24:8:16. Now the reason I select this one is that the ratio of NPK is perfect for plants. The ratio here is 3:1:2. And that's the same thing as a 24:8:16, except that the 24:8:16 has more fertilizer in it. I've taken the recommended dilution ratios on the Miracle-Gro container and calculated some of the nutrients in this mixture. And here's a comparison between Miracle-Gro and our DIY fertilizer, which is claimed to be exactly the same as Miracle-Gro. The first line there is the most important nutrient, and that's nitrogen. You can see the DIY is 2.5 parts per million. Whereas Miracle-Gro is 300 parts per million. Now, I think 300 is a bit high for most plants, and I generally recommend a value of about 100 to 150. 200 also works, but you don't want to go over 200. But if you compare even 100 to what is in our DIY fertilizer, you see that there's almost no nitrogen in this DIY fertilizer. Without nitrogen, plants won't grow. Phosphorus and potassium are also macronutrients, and they're critical for plant growth. Miracle-Gro has the right amounts, but our DIY solution, it has 0. What about calcium? That's just as important as magnesium. And in fact, the amount of calcium and the amount of magnesium should be about the same. If you have a lot of one and none of the other, it can cause problems in plant growth. In our DIY fertilizer, we do have magnesium, but we have no calcium. You can see that Miracle-Gro doesn't add these two nutrients, which may be a surprise to you. But it turns out most of our water sources have enough calcium and magnesium in them. We don't have to add more with our fertilizer. And that's why Miracle-Gro doesn't add them. Now, if we go down the list and look at some of the micronutrients, things like boron, copper, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, we see that our DIY fertilizer has none of these. And yet Miracle-Gro has some of each. These are also important for plant growth. They don't need a lot of these, but they do need low levels of these to grow. And finally, at the bottom of the list is sodium. We don't want sodium in our fertilizer, and Miracle-Gro doesn't add it, but for some strange reason, this DIY solution does. Well, by now you probably guessed what I think of this DIY fertilizer. Number one, it's just terrible for plant growth. Not enough nitrogen, no micronutrients, and it has extra sodium in it. These mixtures make no sense at all. The claim that this fertilizer is like Miracle-Gro is complete nonsense. This idea of using things from the kitchen and gardening doesn't make any sense. Let's use the proper fertilizer and make sure we get great plants. If you want to save money, watch my video about fertilizer myths and you can get to it right here. Happy gardening.